How's it going, everyone? My name is Christopher, my dad Leighton, and this is the Oosthuisen Show. Today we have an amazing show talking about rattlesnake avoidance training and how to keep your dog safe in the desert. And we've got a live diamondback rattlesnake that we're going to bring out in just a moment here. But first, we have a few words from our sponsors.
So obviously our main sponsor is Partners Dog Training. We really appreciate the opportunity to be able to use Partners as sort of a medium to be able to get the word out to you guys. And of course we appreciate you guys signing in. We had a little technical problem in the first part of this, and we're trying to fix that. So we're going to go back and we're going to run it on our normal feed, which means we can't show you all the cool video that we've got, but we'll see if we can bring that back by next week. We're going to get a real snake out here in a second, a live snake, and show you that, so that's kind of cool. I'm going to
talk a little bit. And just so you know, I was watching the Joe Rogan podcast, which is, they do thousands of episodes, and even they have technical difficulties, so we're not alone here. But the second sponsor for us is a program called HeyLudwig. It's a new thing that we just released a couple months ago on Facebook Messenger. Essentially, you can actually message Ludwig. You tell him about your dog, and he uses your dog's behavioral traits and characteristics to create personalized curriculums to fix problems, teach tricks, train obedience. There's a puppy program in there. We're going to add potty training and barking and all these different problems down the line. So it's a really good program. It's very inexpensive, so if you don't have access to us here in Arizona, it still gives you an opportunity to access our experience and the stuff that we've built up over the past 20 years, training almost 40,000 dogs now. So definitely check that out. We'll attach a link to it, but you can go onto Messenger and search HeyLudwig and start training there. So in a moment here, you're gonna grab the snake, and we'll talk a little bit about what rattlesnake avoidance training is. But essentially, rattlesnake avoidance training is where we teach dogs to avoid the scent and sound of a rattlesnake. We don't train sight, and we'll talk a little bit about why we don't train sight in just a moment here, but it's the scent and sound of a rattlesnake. And it actually got started, I would say, we started about 20 years back.
18 years ago. It started search and rescue. I used to teach some of the dogs with the search and rescue people, and we didn't like one of the systems, or the system that was being used for training these dogs. They were using defang snakes, and I didn't really, we found we had issues with the defang. First of all, we don't like to defang a snake, because what that really means, you're holding the head of the snake and you're cutting the fangs out, and I personally don't like to harm an animal, especially not in the work that we do. We have a responsibility to look after them, even though some people don't like snakes. So we changed that system. We came in, we brought in some different techniques. We tested to see how to look, to see which ones we're getting a better result from. And that's how the snake proofing that we do now has been kind of formed over the last 15 to 18 years that we've been doing this. I just want to mention real quick, I'm really glad to see all you guys coming back in again. I know we had a little technical problem earlier on, and I appreciate you guys hanging around. John, good to see you, and Kim Malucci, nice to see you again, and Michael and Luella's must be my biggest fan, I think, because she's there every time. And Jen is also Jen is one of our instructors, and actually was at snake proofing this morning.
Yep.
So now that it looks like we're back up and live and running, I think maybe we'll get the snake out and kind of show you guys again. Get my blood pressure up a little bit more. This snake's pretty hot. We had him out earlier on, and he was not happy being in front of the cameras. Just for you guys' knowledge, snakes are not something we want to mess around with. This is a real fanged, poisonous, whatever, venomous snake. We are licensed by Game and Fish to have these snakes and to work with them. And one of the things that we do is we try and encourage people not to mess around with them. So I've done this for many, many years. I've worked literally with hundreds and hundreds of snakes during that time. We want to try and keep people safe. Getting bitten by a snake is catastrophic. It's kind of funny because a lot of times people will come to us and say, have you ever been bitten by a snake? I'm like,
actually, the best question was like, do you let the dogs get bitten by the snakes? So I was like, we wouldn't be in business.
That would be pretty catastrophic.
If just like every single dog came in here that we're letting them get bit by snakes and teaching them. Actually, that's a good point. So for people that have had their dogs been bitten by a snake, it actually doesn't teach a negative association at that moment. And the reason why is because a snake bite itself doesn't harm very much. And it's so quick that a lot of times dogs don't even get that association. The pain is actually what comes a lot later down the line, and that's not associated to the actual snake and to the smell and the sounds that they were hearing at the time. So we often get people that say, oh, my dog was bitten, so he'll avoid snakes now, or she'll avoid snakes now, and it's actually not the case. They still have to get that type of training that we do in order to make sure that they do stay away from rattlesnakes. So let's...
Now, for instance, if you have a scorpion, that's actually different, because the scorpion has a bite, or a sting obviously, that is instant pain for the dog. Dogs learn really fast to not mess around with scorpions. But snakes are not like that. They don't understand that that snake bite is the thing that's going to injure them later on or kill them. And so they tend to not worry about it.
And just so you guys know, the training that we do as well is only for rattlesnakes. Now, it's technically only for diamondback rattlesnakes, but most dogs can't tell the difference between the different species of rattlesnakes. We typically use diamondbacks in training, but for instance, if we did training with the training that we do, it wouldn't work for a scorpion, it wouldn't work for lizards, it wouldn't work for bull snakes or any other venomous snake or any other type of snake, because there actually is a different association to the training that we're doing and those other types of critters. And
the marker, the association is different. There is a lot of theory, and Jen, I see Jen wrote us a question. See what Michael wrote there? We need a backdrop. We're working on it, Michael. We have a backdrop coming. In fact, this might be the last time we actually use this setting that we're in right now. We're working on a new place that we maybe will have up and running next week. But anyway, Jen asked the question. Jen Shelton asked the question. Jen's actually one of our instructors at the school. Big question is, do they smell the same as other venomous snakes? The truth is, we don't really know for sure, but we believe, just based on experience and the testing I've done, because I've actually tested a couple of other snakes and had a look to see. So here's the answer, is that some dogs have the ability to discriminate between the different odors of different snakes. So for instance, if I had to take something like a bloodhound that has had a trained nose, maybe one of the search dogs, we've seen, for example, that the search and rescue dogs will detect our snakes from 50, 75 feet away. Last year I worked with some of the Border Patrol people, and their dogs were amazing. Those dogs were picking up these snakes from way out.
Especially if the wind direction is blowing the scent into them.
And then you get other dogs, like some of the flat-nosed dogs and so forth, or a dog that just basically doesn't have his brain switched on, and those dogs can literally walk right up to the snake and be 3 inches from the snake and not smell the snake. And then after training, they gradually learn to do that. So it's unlikely those dogs will be able to discriminate between different types of snakes. We've been approached to do snake avoidance training in California, and I know Florida, they have some other venomous snakes down there. The moccasin, I think it's moccasin, water moccasin, I think it's called. I have absolutely no idea whether there's a similarity between the odor of that snake and the snakes that we use here, which of course are the diamondbacks. Now, there's a whole bunch of species of snakes, of course. Here in Arizona, I believe we have 11 different species of rattlesnakes. We mostly, as Christopher said, use the diamondbacks, but we've also done some training with the timber snake and with Mojaves and so forth. And what I found is that most dogs don't, they can tell that, so they can detect a Mojave and a rattlesnake, but they can't detect that there's a difference between them. They just know that particular odor is something that's negative. Remember that they don't know it's a snake. We actually never introduce the visual or the sight association to dogs. I personally don't like doing that. We get a lot of false positives on those dogs that have been trained using that system. A false positive is where a dog alerts on something that that dog thinks is a negative, so in this case a snake, but you see the same thing in law enforcement with dogs that are trained to find bombs. We've got a couple of good friends that are in the bomb squad and that we've trained with, and sometimes if those dogs give a false positive, that means that they're detecting something that they perceive to be a positive, but in actual fact it's not the real thing. So what we found with visual association with snakes is that a snake, that anything that looks like a snake, like a stick or a garden hose or a pipe or a shadow or any of those things, a lot of times if dogs have been trained on the visual side, then they will alert on those particular things, and that of course causes a lot of issues for people. So real quick question from Luella, and then we will get back to, we'll actually get the snake out so you guys can see. And I see we have 10 people listening. That's awesome. Appreciate you guys paying attention. So Luella asked, where do we get our snakes? All the snakes we've got are rescues. The snakes are brought to us by people. We kind of actively encourage through social media, through emails to people. If you find a snake and you can't live with that snake in your house or in your garden because obviously you're worried about it, you can either call the fire department. Sometimes they'll come out, other times they won't. There are some private services, or if you can safely recover the snake or put it in a drum or something like that, then you can bring it to us without killing the snake. I don't want you to kill the snakes if possible. I prefer that you bring them to us. So all our snakes actually come from there. And we keep them for years. They basically get used to being in our, we have a special room that's constructed for them. They have their own cages. They get fed regularly, etc. Obviously, and we rotate them around as well because we don't want to overwork or wear out a snake, especially snakes that are really hot that react to movement and so forth. We don't even use those. They basically just stay behind, or we use them for our photography. So that's where we get our snakes from. We don't go get them out of the wild. You're not allowed to do that. And just for the same reason, you're not allowed to transport them across state lines. So we can't take our snakes to California or vice versa or whatever. So, all right, let's get the little boy out back us. He's a little quiet here behind me. I hope he's still in his box. What if he's not there? That might be a real short program tonight if he's not in his cage. Okay, hold on 1 second. So remember what we said. When we work with these snakes, we don't mess around. Yep, good thing he's still there. So when we work with snakes, we want to be gentle with them, kind of look after them. So there he is. I can't see what you can see because I don't have a monitor, but I think that the camera can see that. You can see he's looking over there past the camera. That's because Christopher's on that side of the room. Right now, their strike radius is about 2/3 of their body length. So I'm holding him towards the end of his body. He can't reach me where he is now, but it sure is scary when they actually do strike at you. That's about as close to me as what I want him. Move him around. You can see his tail at the back. I'll change the angle a little bit. You guys can see his tail. And again, when we handle them, we want to be kind to them. We don't want to be rough on the snakes. He's a good guy. Cleans up a lot of rodents and everything. Part of the ecosystem. There we go. All right, one last look. I don't know if Jessica's watching, but by all means comment and let us know. There we go. All right, say goodbye. Maybe we'll get him out towards the end of the show. So as you can see, we have protocols in place. Whenever we're handling a snake, we only have one person in the area. Christopher went to the other side of the room. We don't want to take any chances. This is not something we want to mess with. The cost of a rattlesnake bite, anything from a few $1,000s up to a couple of $100,000. So it's definitely not something we want to test out and theorize about. If you guys are out in the wild, I don't know if you know this, but the ratio of bites to people, do you remember what that is?
In terms
bites
of
on people, the age demographic.
The age demographic, yeah, I do know. It's 18 to what, 30?
24, 18 to 24.
24-year-old males.
And they normally have been drinking. So that should tell you guys something. So Christopher, you're 18 to 24, but you know enough to know not to mess with these guys,
definitely,
right?
Definitely stay away. I mean, I don't even like taking them out of their cages and so forth. I usually get him to do it because it just kind of gives me the heebie-jeebies. I don't mind actually like carrying the cage because we have a cage here behind us. You can see this is actually what we use for the rattlesnake avoidance training for the people that are listening afterwards. And just so you guys know, we are on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and every other place where you can get podcasts as well. So you can definitely listen to us after if you're not able to actually watch this live or if you're not able to watch any of the future episodes or past episodes live. So for the people that are watching and for the people listening, we have a cage behind us. So it's double mesh wire cage. It's typically in a cylinder like this that you see behind us. We have one actually out at the snake avoidance session that's buried underground, and that allows for dogs to go out and put their nose into the cage, really get a really strong, potent scent.
Outside of the cage, on the outside lip of the cage, not into the cage.
Yeah, exactly. But it really focuses that scent down for them to pick up on it really, really strong. And so that's what we use as the first cage to train scent. So we have a whole process that we've designed and kind of perfected over the years. There is no perfect system. There's no guarantees in training. That we're working with animal behavior, working with dogs. So every single dog is different. Last year we trained about 1,500 dogs. This year we're on track to do another 3,000. Yep. And you really get a chance to see every single type of behavior and personality trait that comes with every single dog and the differences and just the way that they're physically made up, and even things like anxiety or pulling on the leash can affect the way that we do training. Now, we've had a lot of experience working with all these different types of dogs, so we know how to change the setup and the order and how we are actually training to make sure that we're getting as effective training as possible. And that's really what you get when you work with us, is that experience that's been built up over the years. But it is pretty interesting to see even dogs that are, you know, flat nosed, so they don't pick up on the scent as well, so we have to do things differently in order to adjust for them, or dogs that are a little bit skittish around other people, around men, changing the setup and so forth to accommodate them. And so it's a very interesting process. So do you want to talk a little bit about how it got started? Yeah.
So you want to talk about?
Or did we talk about how it got started?
Yeah, we did mention that earlier on. It's kind of confusing because we had two starts to the program, but we did talk about how it got started, search and rescue, and then we kind of developed it from then.
Yep.
So let's run through what it actually happens. So the first thing is, when your dog arrives at snake proofing, we want to dress your dog. We call that dressing. We put an electronic collar on the dog. It's a stim collar. It doesn't hurt the dogs, despite what people think. We have lots of people that are really worried about that, and what we'll do is we'll let them feel the collar if they wish to, and 90% of the time they basically say, oh wow, that's all that is, that's not a big deal. And truthfully, it's not a big deal. After we put the collar on the dog, we'll also put a long line and just a slip collar on. We want to make sure that the dog cannot get away from us. The last thing we need is a dog that's running loose or anything like that. That would obviously be a catastrophic situation. And we use a long leash, normally 25, 30-foot long leash, that allows us to train the dog but not be directly on top of the dog. And then obviously we're teaching the dog to try and get away, and I'll come to that in a second. So once the dog is dressed, we then want the dog to stand there or sit for about 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah, real quick, because we get a question a lot that why don't we use the person's equipment, because we want it to be the same as the person when they're on the walk. And so not only is there the safety reasons where we don't want a dog to slip out of a harness, which most dogs come in, or
harnesses are not reliable for restraining a dog. They're fine for when the dog's going forward, but if a dog stops and turns around and backs out, they can back out of a harness. So we don't trust harnesses very much.
Yeah, so the safety reason is obviously a big critical thing, but we also want to make sure that the training is objective to the dog and the snake. It's just between the dog and the snake. We don't want to let we don't want to let your equipment, we don't want to let you handling the dog interfere with anything. We're just trying to keep it as objective and really scientific as possible.
We call those contaminants. Every time something happens that's not directly the training involved, and that's a contaminant, meaning that it distracts the dog, it breaks down the training, it contaminates the association possibly. Our snake proofing area is being cleaned completely so that we don't have odor of weeds, which is a big problem this time of year obviously, and other things going on. We want that training to be as clean or as pure as possible. So once we got the dog dressed, and I mentioned that we keep the dog, we want them to be dressed for 5 to 10 minutes before we actually start the training. Sometimes people will say, well, how come we haven't started training when the dog has been ready for 5 or 10 minutes? The answer to that is that we want the dogs to be able to get some time getting accustomed or acclimated to the equipment that's on them.
Desensitized.
There's an issue called collar savvy, where you put a collar on the dog and the dog knows that something's going on at this point in time. That's a big problem for us. So we don't want that to happen. We want to try and avoid that as much as possible. It still does happen, unfortunately, especially dogs that have been e-collar trained. They'll come in, they're a little collar savvy, they know something's up, bird dogs, those types of things. Then we'll bring the dog and we'll introduce the dog to the first cage, the cage that Christopher talked about. That's the one that's in the ground. The reason again for that is we want to have a really strong concentration of odor directly at the cage where we want to do the training. We call that the cone, or the point of the cone, the tip of the cone. And if you imagine kind of like a cone coming out like that, the tip of the cone is where the odor is the strongest, the scent is the strongest, and then as the cone moves out, as the scent path or the pattern moves away from that cage, the cone becomes less concentrated, meaning that the odor is less concentrated, and therefore it's a little bit more difficult for a dog to detect. Now, very good dogs with good noses, they can detect trace amounts of that odor 15, 20, 25 feet away. Those are the ones that are pretty easy to train. The tricky ones are the ones that are not sniffing. They might be insecure, they might be nervous, they might be worrying about us. But those are the dogs that create much more of a difficult training process for us. A dog that won't walk on a leash, a dog that is nervous of life in general, a dog that is stressing about just being around people or whatever the case is. They're almost impossible to train in some cases. Whenever we have a failure, it almost always revolves around something like that. Anyway, on the good dogs, the dogs that make it through, once we've got that dog up against the odor, once he, what we call recognizes, or he associates with that odor. Now, what we mean by associate is actually quite tricky. Associate could be a change of behavior. Often we'll tell people, watch for COB, change of behavior. what was the dog's behavior like walking up towards the cage, and then as he picks up on that odor, you'll sometimes see a little ear flick, you'll sometimes see him pay more attention. Once he gets that, we want to give him a second or two to soak on that and kind of take it in, and then we'll give him a nick. The best nick is when we startle the dog. The more we can startle the dog, the better result we get. And sometimes that's hard to see, but for the most part, it's not that difficult to pick up. Once they get a startle, then we'll tell the trainer to run the dog out, and we'll teach the dog, okay, we want you to leave that area. And we'll repeat that sometimes 2, 3, 4 times, depending on the case, depending on the amount of recognition we've got. And basically what we're looking for is that if we try and go back towards that cage, the dog must show resistance, must show he's not going to go in, he's trying to pull out. And you'll get every variation from dogs that are literally trying to pull us in the opposite direction to a dog, especially dogs that have had a lot of obedience training, they'll kind of become heel happy, they'll go up, hug the trainer.
But you can definitely see that they're a lot more anxious. And so a lot of times now we've actually brought people back into the session. When we first started out, we wouldn't let people come back because we didn't want to contaminate, like we mentioned earlier. But
distract
the dogs, yeah. But now we've since brought people back because we do feel like that it's important for the owners to be able to see how their dog responds, so that in the future, if they feel a similar situation start to correspond, then they know maybe their dog is avoiding and picking up on the snake. And so because we have family members outside, we'll point out to them, all right, now look where your dog is right now. That's what we call a baseline. So that's where the dog is starting out. Usually they're relaxed, they're sniffing around, they're showing curiosity to the different trees and the sounds and the smells and the birds and everything like that. And then as we start guiding them into that first cage or into the second cage, and after they get that first nick, then we're starting to point out, okay, now look at their change of behavior. Look what they started from in that baseline and what's different now in terms of the way that they're reacting. And even similar in a way where if we walk in one direction, maybe the dog starts to relax a little bit, starts to show a little bit more curiosity and sniffing around. But then when we start changing direction and we walk towards that scent or towards that cage or towards that sound, then all of a sudden the dog starts showing that avoidance, showing that anxiousness, showing whatever it is in terms of a change of behavior that we can then identify and point out to the client, so that when they are walking the dog maybe in the future and they show similar signs, that they can pick up on that and keep both themselves and their dogs safe and walk in the other direction.
So something I want to talk about is how perfect is this? First of all, as Christopher said earlier on, it's not a perfect science. What we're doing is we're trying to introduce the odor and subsequently the sound of a snake to a dog and create a negative association. It works. I hate percentages, but if you want to pin me down to a percentage, probably 95 to 98% of the time. Let me explain that number to you. So if we train, and we train roughly, this year we're on track to do a couple of thousand dogs, but if we do, let's say 100 dogs.
Just so everyone knows the scale of that, I would say a typical trainer, just like a dog trainer, might train like 50 dogs in a year. And a rattlesnake avoidance trainer might train like maybe 100 dogs in a year. We're doing like on track for 3,000 just this year alone, and we've done that for the past 17 years. So we've trained about probably 18 to 20,000 dogs in rattlesnake avoidance training alone in the past couple of years. So the scale in terms of percentages in the past 20 years, yeah, the scale in 18 years, the scale in terms of how many dogs and how many different kind of variables. I see that that John mentioned, all the different confounding variables. There's a ton of training that goes into the handlers themselves that are just walking the dog on the leash, all the way down to the people that are running the remote and running the session, because you have to, the instructors.
Yeah, it takes about a year to teach an instructor, and that's about, each instructor will have 300 to 500 dogs that they'll train before they are.
I think so. So right now, I think we're on track for, it's 2 years of handling, and then another year of instructing with another instructor watching over you.
We'll often have two instructors on the location. And we mention all these things because people often ask us, why do we say we're the best? Well, we're the best because we put the most amount of effort into training our staff, making sure, I mean, I've been doing this the longest of everybody, and I'm out there probably 2 out of 3 times, just monitoring, just having a look, watching the training. I'll walk up to the instructor, it's either Christopher or one of the other 3 instructors, and we'll sit and we'll analyze every dog because we want the best possible result. When we have people, clients, if you guys want to come up and watch your dogs being trained, that's fine, no problem at all. What we'll do is we'll put somebody with you to kind of explain what's going on, because we don't want the instructor being distracted by the training, by the clients or by the people standing there and having to talk to them, etc.
And the reason why we're so strict on all this stuff is because we're really dealing with the dog's life and possibly the owner's life, because this type of training, if you mess up and you make a mistake, and while it's not a perfect science, we try to make it as perfect as we can. If you make a mistake and that dog gets bit, that's obviously incredibly serious. And so we take it very, very seriously in terms of that. It's probably, out of everything that we do here, the most make or break kind of point in terms of the least amount of time we have to interact with the dog and trying to have the greatest amount of effect. So we definitely put a lot of emphasis on that.
And there are dogs that fail training. There's dogs that fail training during training, and then there's dogs, we know of one dog so far out of the few hundred dogs we've trained this year. We had one dog that did subsequently get bitten after training. I haven't had a chance to meet with the owners yet or chat with them. We want them to bring their dog back so we can look and we can evaluate what it was that went wrong. But the kinds of things that go wrong is if you have a situation where dogs are chasing critters, if you have a dog that's chasing bunnies or lizards or chasing a ball out the desert and they're charging through the desert, the last thing on earth they're going to have time to do is to pick up on the odor or the sound of a rattlesnake, and they may just come across. And I think this particular dog, I think I was told he was bitten on the hindquarters, so he may just have been running past it. I don't know this particular dog, but it's quite possible. We had a search and rescue dog many years ago that we trained that was chasing a bunny, ran down a hole. The bunny ran down a hole, dog stuck its nose in the hole. There was a snake in the hole, the snake struck the dog on the nose. Again, same thing, dog just didn't have time to pick up on that.
Their brains turn to mush when they're
in prey drive, right.
Exactly.
Probably my best or worst story, depending on how you want to look at it, are Jack Russells. You know, of all the dogs that we failed at, meaning dogs that have been subsequently bitten, out of the tens of thousands of dogs, our Jack Russells are the most common breed because they have such an incredible high hunt drive. I had a client show up here one day, it was on a Tuesday, and he bet me that his dog cannot be snake-proof. Well, we trained the dog. The dog actually did okay in training, and 2 days later the guy called me and said that his dog had got into a fight with a rattlesnake and that the snake had bitten the dog 6 times, and the dog eventually killed the snake, but the dog also passed away from the injuries. So, you know, it really does depend on certain things, and the problem is that with some breeds, they just have such a high, intense drive to hunt that nothing that we do or that the owners are going to do is going to change that.
And it's so interesting because there's a couple of different things. So there's prey drive, and then there's chase drive, and then there's hunt drive, and there's still like many other drives down the line that
most people just refer to prey drive as covering everything. But there are specific things like Christopher said.
So the hunt drive is the actual desire to literally kill the thing that they're going after, and that's different than prey drive, which is really just out of the excitement, and it's pretty similar to chase drive.
Most dogs are not going to eat a rattlesnake, they just do it because it's fun to hunt, etc. So you know, we want to make sure people always understand that even with training you got to make sure that your dog stays safe. And that brings me to another issue. If you're in a high risk environment, you know, you're always out in the desert or whatever, you might want to also consider having your dog vaccinated against snake bite. Now, it is a little controversial. There's some people that feel that introducing that venom into your dog as a vaccine is in itself a bad thing. I've known a bunch of dogs that have had the the snake bite venom vaccine done, and they've had no after effects from it or ill effects from it. But I've been told there have been dogs that have had a reaction to that. So that's something you want to talk to your vet. If your vet doesn't do it, not everybody does it. There are a lot of vets that don't do it or don't want to do it. Chat with them, get some information and so on. On my side, I personally think it's a good idea because what it does is that it reduces the level of damage to your dog. You still have to it's still an emergency, you still have to get treatment, but it gives you time. Earlier on, Christopher and I were talking about how much time it takes. You know, if you can get to a hospital within an hour or so, you probably will make it, but it depends on how the dog has been bitten. Did the snake inject a full amount of venom? Was the dog fighting with the snake, in which case the snake's going to bite the dog 2 or 3 times? If a dog just gives a snake if the dog is just passing, a lot of times that snake will give like a warning strike. I actually have some really good video that we were going to show you tonight in the program, where you could see in slow motion that the snake was striking at the camera, but he hadn't actually brought his teeth out at all, his fangs. He was just striking. So that's almost like a tap on the front. Now, a lot of times those are just warning taps. The snake is actually not injecting venom.
Like a dry bite.
We refer to that in the industry as a dry bite. You know, when you get into these terms, I'm always cautious of saying these things because I'm sure that I'm going to have some expert out there that tells me there's no such thing. You know, it's the same thing as baby snakes. Does a baby snake have a more infectious venom, or is it because they can't control the venom sacs? Well, the truth is we don't know. We've worked with snakes forever, and I've heard both sides of that from herpetologists and from people that have worked with them. The bottom line is just don't mess with baby snakes because they definitely have a more severe reaction. And in my personal opinion, I think it has something to do with the fact that they just haven't learned how to control or minimize their venom. So,
and one thing that's really important as well is that even after you've had the training, or your dog's had the training, to keep doing what we call the refreshers. And that's basically where we bring your dog back, we test them again after usually 6 months, sometimes a year, sometimes longer, to make sure that they haven't become complacent. And the best way to explain that is if you're driving down the road and you see a police car or a cop car on the side of the road, you might slow down for the next couple miles, but I guarantee after a little bit you're going to start picking up the speed again.
I don't do that.
Yeah, no one does that, right?
Yeah.
Every single time that I mention that in training, then I usually see the wife is like, yeah, and then the dad in the back's kind of smiling like, yeah, that might be me.
That might be us.
So, and that's
but we
really
can fix
the
it.
best
We
way.
can put an e-collar on them.
Yep.
And train you. The moment you go over the speed limit, boom, you get that little e-collar nick, right? But of course, it doesn't really hurt.
So what the refreshers do is that it puts it back in the dog's mind that, hey, you're supposed to stay away from that scent, you're supposed to stay away from that sound, and it's really, really critical to the overall success. I would say a good percentage of the time when we see people that that their dogs have been bitten by a snake after training, it's because that they waited a year, 2, 3 years at a time when they were recommended to come back in 6 months or recommended to come back in a year time, and they didn't, and they suffered because of it.
And let's talk about that for a second. When we tell you we think your dog should have it done in 6 months or in a year or every 2 years or whatever, that time frame is determined by how your dog has reacted during training. So if you bring your dog back for a refresher, and I see a whole bunch of people,
type of personality traits your dog
Rhonda
has.
Chrisman had a dog in today for a refresher. She says the staff was awesome. Love to hear that, Rhonda. Anita was asking somebody, do you have training during summer? Yeah, obviously we're training like crazy right now. How can they sign up for training? And then I'll go back to the refresher.
Yeah, so right now we have all signups online. It's a new thing we actually just released this year, and it's been going really well. Some people have had a little bit of trouble with it, but overall it's been going really well. I think we've signed up about 400 people just in the past. We've been training for now like 2 weeks. Started in the beginning of March. So go on to partnersdogs.com, and it's actually partnersdogs.com/snake-avoidance. But if you just go to partnersdogs.com and you go to our programs and snake avoidance, then there'll be the full sign up page there. You can also learn a little bit more about the program if you didn't get a chance to listen to us through this whole podcast.
And we'll post a link to the videos that we were going to show. The one video that shows the whole process of training. We'll put that on the Facebook page just after we finish wrap up here tonight as well.
So on the page there, and basically you just select if it's your first time or if you're coming back for a refresher. Really simple. You select that, you select the time, tell a little bit of info about your dog, and then pay, and then you're set. And then we send a little bit of information in the next couple days in terms of your email and so forth. So it's a really simple process that we've just introduced this year. And like I said, we're on track to train about 3,000 dogs this year, which we're really excited about because it's definitely the most that we've ever done. But we still feel like we're barely just touching the surface in terms of the amount of dogs that are in Arizona, and truly every single dog that lives in Arizona should get this type of training, because even in the very populated city areas that have been occupied a lot, we still get reports of people finding snakes. I mean, literally I had someone tell me just the other day that they live in downtown Phoenix and their neighbor had a snake in their backyard. And so even if you're in a very populated area, if you're in a very cityscape area, still get the training, because you never know when you might just be on a walk, maybe you go on a hike one day, and that's the time where you come across a snake. Some people, they have terrible luck and they've got 7 snakes that they've seen this year already, and me personally, I've never seen a snake in the wild.
You actually have.
We didn't go looking for.
One day,
we didn't go looking for.
So one day, Christopher and I, when he was a little guy, we always used to go for a ride on the quad in the afternoon. So Christopher would sit with me on the quad, and we were riding through the back of the property, and I kind of stopped and I said, hey, do you see anything? And he's looking around, and all of a sudden he went airborne off the side of the quad because there was a snake right next to it. Do you remember that?
No, I don't.
That was right up here where we trained.
Oh,
so
I don't remember that.
That was, damn, I wish I had a video. You wouldn't have video back in those days like we did now.
Yeah.
Jen answered the question. Thank you. So Shelley Dinsmore, nice of you to join us, Shelley. Thank you to everybody for coming in. We really appreciate it. Great turnout tonight. I'm sorry we lost some people in the beginning. But anyway, great turnout. Shirley asked, how much does it cost? The cost of training is $99
for the first time.
The first time
and
that you
$79 for all refreshers.
For refreshers. So when you come back for a refresher, and I didn't finish talking about refreshers, I started talking about it. So basically a refresher is where we bring your dog back and we check to see whether your dog remembers the training from before. Now here's what most of the time happens in a refresher. Dogs become a little bit kind of like lackadaisical, a little bit basically laid back about it. They remember the smell, the odor, because that's obviously the first thing we test, but they kind of need that reminder, right?
They kind of test their limits.
Yep. So it's kind of like Christopher was saying, the police officer, you need the moment you see those flashing lights, then you're like, oh, okay, that's my reminder, now I'll be good for a little while, and so you go on. So it's generally a good idea to have those refreshers done on a regular basis to keep reminding your dog. Now, if you have a high drive dog, we want to see that dog in every 6 months, and some of our dogs will actually redo their training every 3 or 4 months. If you have a dog that's done really well during its refreshers, we'll push that out to every year, maybe even every couple of years. This is something we've changed a little bit over the last 3 to 4 years. We used to kind of push dogs out further afield, but we started realizing when they came in for the refreshers that a lot of them needed that refresher done a little bit sooner.
And now it's usually better just to err on the side of caution. Like I even tell people, you know, even if you come back before 6 months, it's typically better, because the worst thing you're going to do is you're going to spend, you know, $70, but you at least get that confirmation in your head and that kind of sense of security that your dog is going to avoid or is likely to avoid if all conditions are equal. And just as a point there, the types of variables you want to talk about, the types of variables that can actually affect what we do in terms of training once your dog is actually out there in the wild. So we talked about a little bit on if your dog is chasing something, if they have a lot of drive, if they have a lot of energy, but some other things like, for instance, if the wind is blowing very hard in the opposite direction, then obviously the scent is then traveling in that direction. Then if the snake doesn't rattle, that's both of the associations that we've trained for that are subsequently taken away, and it puts your dog at a higher risk of being bitten. So
if you're upwind of the snake, in other words, right? Just so you understand.
So the wind is blowing in the opposite direction of where your dog's coming from. So the scent is that way, and your dog's coming from, or you're coming from this side, and that makes it a lot more difficult for your dog to pick up on it. Some dogs can still pick up on it, but it makes it a lot harder. Another thing, like I said, if the snake doesn't rattle, that's part of the association that's taken away. Another variable is that if dogs are panting very heavily, so if you've been on a walk for a long time and your dog gets hot outside and they're panting very heavily, they don't use their nose as much in those situations, and so it can be a little bit harder for them to pick up on the scent in those cases. I'm trying to think if there's any other, so the panting, obviously if they've got a flat nose, if they have a cold, that can also affect it, or if they are reverse sneezing a lot.
If they reverse sneezing, and also if they have kennel cough, something like it. Anything that affects their ability to scent, and obviously, you know, sound. And something else on the sound, so I got a really cool story to tell you, and I'm not going to mention names because obviously we haven't organized it yet, but today I had a really interesting conversation with somebody in the horse world, and we might be getting involved in snake avoidance training for horses. I've actually done it before. Christopher he didn't even know about this until right now. You saw the email? But I've actually done it before, and it does work. I'm no expert on snake avoidance for horses. Did I say that right? Yeah. But I've been riding horses ever since I could walk, and in fact before I could walk. So we're going to look at that, and if we're successful with that, then we'll let you guys know, and if you have horses, you can train them on that as well. But I do know many years ago, Allison Hunter and I, that's Chad's mom, when we used to train, then she had horses, and we successfully trained her horses, especially if they trail ride, teach them to stay away from them. They can pick up on the odor as well. They're not as easy to train as what dogs are, but certainly they are trainable, and we're going to be offering that a little bit.
Take a look at it. So one question that Mira had was, how long do we do rattlesnake avoidance training for? So it really depends on the weather. We try to start as it starts warming up, like this year. Last year we started in the middle of February. This year we planned it for the end of February, and because we had that big cold front, if you were living in Arizona at the time, we had a big cold front that came through, and so it even now, I think it was still like 60, 70 degrees, maybe 80 degrees today down here, whereas most of the time this time of year is like 100, upwards of 100 degrees. And so because this year's been a lot colder, we've had to push out and start a little bit later. Because when it's colder weather, dogs just respond a little bit differently in terms of picking up the scent. Snakes are not as lively. Technically, the scent is what we believe not as potent, because if you imagine if you had a piece of meat standing out inside in a hot kitchen, that scent is going to be a lot more potent than if it's in a fridge. And so because of that, also snakes are less likely to rattle. Now, the one thing that people often ask is that do snakes go into hibernation during the winter periods? And they actually don't go into what we call hibernation, is what you think of like snakes just going into a den and not
like a little wolf going into a den, or
for
a bear goes into a cave and he's then gone for the next 3 or 4 months, whatever it is.
So what
snakes
happens
are still around.
They're still around, but they just become a little bit less active. And because they're not out sunbathing as much, people are less likely to see them. So we do definitely get less spottings during like December, January, February months. But they still are active, and they still your dog can still come across them if, for instance, they get hungry and they need to come out for a snack. And that's the time when you're going for your night walk. So that's an interesting kind of point.
Yeah, and
we start usually, just real quick, we start at the, this year we started at the beginning of March, and we're going to finish up typically around middle of November, beginning of November, depending again on the weather.
They're right. And you know what's interesting about that time frame thing, Christopher, is that a lot of people are much more concerned about snakes at the beginning of snake season, which is now, because it's kind of like it's a news item. And there's a great story by KTR, and again, we'll post that on. I think we were going to play it for you earlier on, or show you the article, but we'll post it. But they were talking about that. The funny part is that all the data that I've seen, more people get bitten at the end of snake season, just before they go into quote-unquote hibernation, if you want to call that. So it's definitely something that to consider. And it's kind of funny because we get a ton of people signing up and snake proofing now, but the truth is we should be getting even more back in that August, September, October phase. I wanted to just, I see we got Jan Hopkins that joined us. Hi, Jan. Nice of you to join us. I actually called you yesterday. Jan and them are plumbers, and we're going to be putting in some upgrades here at our school. And I called Jan because I wanted them to actually do the plumbing for us. So Jan, touch base with me tomorrow, and let's get this thing going. I think I'm going to get the snake out one more time. For those of you who didn't see it at the beginning of the program, we'll kind of like wrap it up over the snake. Do you have anything else you want to add before I do that?
We just kind of have our question of the day, which is, have you ever seen a live rattlesnake in the wild? And if so, just comment below and tell us a little about your story, and tell us if you have had your dog trained to avoid rattlesnakes yet, or if you're thinking about doing it. And let us know if you guys want to get that training, or if you want to take advantage of any of the other.
And you know what, I remember I saw a question earlier on about that. Just one other thing: if your dog cannot walk on a leash, they cannot train or whatever, that does make it difficult for us to train your dog. But if you reach out to the office and have a chat with them, we're working on putting together a program for those of you, because there's actually quite a few dogs that cannot do that, where you can come in, drop your dog off for the day. It's kind of like be a daycare type thing where the dog stays here with us for the day, and then during the day we'll put some obedience on them, see if we can get them walking on a leash. If we're able to do that, then we'll see if we can snake avoidance train them.
Even if you just do it a little bit at home, it makes a huge difference. Typically we see dogs that are like on flexi collars or on harnesses are usually the worst ones in terms of walking well on a leash. So just practice your dog on like a normal collar that goes around their neck. And if you do a little bit of practice at home, then it usually makes it a lot easier to do training at the school. And we've had pretty good success this year. Shelly asked a quick question: how long does training take? So the actual training...
I think she's talking about training for obedience, by the way.
Oh, okay. Well, either way, for rattlesnake avoidance training, the actual time period of the training itself is about 5 to 10 minutes, depending on the dog. But typically you're going to be there for about 20 minutes so that we can put the collars and stuff on, let your dogs desensitize to the equipment, and then a little bit of time at the end for the recap and for our suggestions in terms of when to come back. So that's pretty much it for us today. Yep. So tune in next week, Wednesday at 6 p.m. Mountain Standard Time.
What are we talking about next week?
Potty training.
Potty training. Oh, my pet subject.
Yeah.
Actually, I hate the subject because it's so...
It's a nightmare.
It's a nightmare. If your dog is not potty trained by the time it reaches year and a half of age, it's a nightmare. But we're going to talk about that. So if you have any friends that are desperate for potty training, get them, give us a call. Don't go just yet. We're going to show you guys the snake here going out, because I see a bunch of people saying thank you tonight, and I really appreciate it. Michael, Mary. Mary's one of our long-standing both clients and people that dial in. And Vicky just said thank you as well. A friend takes the dogs. Snakes are a big problem. Yuma is crazy. I mean, that place down there, I've seen snakes down there when I've been out there competing. So, all right, guys, thanks very much. We're going to show you the snake one more time, and then we're going to let you out. Christopher's got to move around to the other side. Hey, Dr. Miller, there you are. Dr. Miller is also one of our long-standing guests. So again, remember what I said earlier? So there's a snaky. So that's a diamondback. This is a young diamondback, probably maybe a year and a half old, I would say. You see he's looking at you guys. I hope the camera can focus on that. I'll see now in a second. There we go. You're wondering what he's looking at. He's not looking at the camera. He's looking at you guys. He's looking right through that screen. Pull back a little bit. About as far from me as what I want him. Remember, they can strike about 2/3 of their body length. I'm holding about halfway up his body right now. We've got some great pictures that we'll put on our Facebook page. You see there's his tail. No, you can't tell the age of a snake by its tail. That just depends on how many times it molts. I suppose it is some indication, but it doesn't really help you very much. We don't work with snakes that are more than about 3 feet long. The longest snake on record, rattlesnake on record, I believe, was about 10 feet, and I've actually seen one that's 9 feet long. It's in the zoo at San Diego. Yeah, he's folding himself up. All right. I'll put him down on Christopher's keyboard, and then I'll leave for the night. All right. Thanks, you guys.
We'll see you next week.
See you next week.